"You shouldn't marry him. You need to look into him more carefully." My mother whispered those exact words directly into my ear. I froze completely. We were standing right in the middle of my perfect engagement party, hosted at our family's massive Whitmore estate. The setting was absolutely beautiful. Warm yellow lights were strung tightly across the vineyard, casting a bright, celebratory glow over the entire evening. Everywhere I looked, I saw our high society guests laughing, drinking expensive champagne, and enjoying the lavish spread of food. Just moments before she pulled me aside, I was standing next to Daniel, feeling incredibly happy and secure about our future together. Everything about the night felt flawless. But then my mother grabbed my arm, pulled me away from the crowd, and dropped that shocking sentence on me. The tone of her voice was what scared me the most. She spoke with absolute certainty, looking at me as if she already possessed some dark, hidden secret about the man I was about to marry. I stood there in the cool night air, totally confused and suddenly anxious. Despite the shock of her words, I immediately trusted her. She was my mother, the person who had managed and guided my entire life. If she said something was wrong, my first instinct was to believe her. But looking back at our history, I really should have seen the warning signs much earlier. My mother had always been deeply suspicious of Daniel, right from the very first day I introduced him to the family. She never just had a normal, polite conversation with him. Every interaction felt like an aggressive interrogation. During our regular Sunday family dinners, she would sit across the table and casually but sharply ask him about his exact monthly income. She didn't stop there. She constantly asked detailed questions about his family background, wanting to know where they came from and what they owned. She would dig into the specific details of his business contracts, asking who his clients were and how much profit he was making. She even interrogated him about whether he had any hidden debts or outstanding student loans. It was never polite curiosity. It was a targeted, relentless investigation. I remember one specific dinner where she cornered him completely. She asked him point-blank about a recent business deal he was working on and demanded to know his backup plan if the entire project went bankrupt. Daniel sat there, trying his best to be respectful and polite, but I could clearly see the tension building in his jaw. He felt intensely scrutinized and judged by her. He felt like he was constantly being evaluated for a corporate merger, not a marriage. And my mother didn't even try to hide her true motives. Very early in our relationship, long before Daniel even proposed to me, she deliberately started bringing up the topic of prenuptial agreements at the dinner table. She would talk loudly about how crucial it was for wealthy families to protect their financial assets from outsiders, making sure Daniel heard and understood every single word. After these exhausting dinners, Daniel and I would get into his car to drive home, and the heavy silence between us would be deafening. Eventually, his frustration would boil over. He told me exactly how uncomfortable my mother made him feel. He said she looked at him like he was a criminal actively trying to steal money from our family. Instead of taking his side or understanding his perspective, I always defended my mother. I told Daniel he was just overreacting and being too sensitive. I justified her behavior by saying things like, "She just wants what is best for me," or "She is just being a protective parent." I genuinely could not see what she was actually doing to him. Every single time I defended her intrusive behavior, I pushed Daniel a little further away. Those arguments in the front seat of his car, those repeated moments where I chose my mother's side over his feelings, created the first real, damaging cracks in our relationship. I was so blind to her manipulation that I allowed her to treat my future husband like a prime suspect. The real turning point, the specific event that finally forced me to open my eyes, happened completely by accident. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at the desk in our family office. I was using the main computer to print out some updated guest lists for the wedding catering. My mother had carelessly left her personal email inbox open on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop through her messages, but a very specific subject line caught my eye immediately and stopped me dead in my tracks. It read, "Whitmore Trust, Post-Marriage Protection Plan." The word trust obviously caught my full attention because it directly involved my personal money and my future inheritance. I didn't hesitate. I clicked on the email to read the contents. What I read on that screen made my blood run completely cold. It was an extensive legal document, part of an ongoing correspondence between my mother and our top estate lawyers. The detailed plan explicitly proposed adding both of my parents as official co-trustees to my trust fund immediately after my wedding day. It didn't stop there. The legal documents clearly outlined a strict strategy to heavily restrict my personal withdrawal rights. It detailed exactly how they were going to shift all of my financial assets into a brand new control structure. And according to the text, this new financial structure would be managed entirely by my parents, leaving me with almost no power. A physical, icy chill ran down my spine. I couldn't even breathe for a few seconds. This wasn't just some standard financial update or a normal family discussion. This was a calculated, aggressive legal move to quietly strip me of my own money the exact second I got married. I printed the email right then and there, marched straight out of the office and into the living room. I slammed the piece of paper down on the glass coffee table right in front of my mother. I demanded to know what this was and why she was doing it behind my back. I expected her to look guilty, to panic, or at least to apologize for hiding it from me. She didn't even blink. She calmly picked up the paper, adjusted her glasses, looked at it for a second, and then looked right at me. She told me, using her softest, most reasonable voice, that it was simply a standard legal procedure designed to protect me from the high risks of marriage. She said, "Elena, you have to understand. This is strictly to ensure that Daniel cannot touch your money if things go wrong between you two." She sounded so incredibly convincing, so logical and rational. She framed the entire secret legal plan around Daniel being a severe potential threat to my livelihood. Because of her calm demeanor, and because she had spent months constantly warning me about his financial status, I actually believed her. But I only believed half of it. The other half of me felt a deep, unsettling knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The seed of heavy doubt had been firmly planted in my mind, not just about Daniel's intentions, but about the very people who claimed to be protecting me. Right after I confronted my mother about that highly suspicious email regarding my trust fund, she did not back down or show any remorse. Instead, she aggressively went on the offensive and launched a full-scale campaign to prove that Daniel was the one who was truly suspicious. She completely ignored my questions about her controlling my money and turned all the focus onto my fiancé. Just a few days later, Victoria called me into her private office in our family home. She walked over to her large mahogany desk, picked up a thick, heavy manila folder, and handed it directly to me. She looked me straight in the eye and told me that she had hired professionals to look into Daniel's background, and this folder contained his complete financial history. I opened the folder right there in front of her. I started reading the pages, and my heart immediately sank. The file was packed with highlighted bank statements, credit reports, and official legal records. The first few pages clearly showed multiple old loans he had taken out years ago. He had never mentioned these loans to me during any of our conversations about our future finances. I kept flipping through the thick stack of papers and found detailed documents about a massive business project he had managed that had completely failed. But the absolute worst part was at the very back of the folder. There was undeniable legal proof that a previous company he founded had gone entirely bankrupt. I was completely shocked by all of this hidden information. Daniel and I had talked about his past before, and he admitted he had faced some standard financial struggles when he was younger, but he never gave me the full, ugly extent of his history. I felt completely betrayed, embarrassed, and lied to. Because my mother had been warning me about him for months, I immediately started to doubt him and seriously question his true intentions. I didn't even wait to process my feelings or calm down. I slammed the folder shut, shoved it into my purse, and drove straight to Daniel's apartment across town. As soon as he opened his front door, I walked right past him without saying hello, marched into his kitchen, and threw the heavy folder down onto his counter. I confronted him directly and angrily about the documents. I yelled at him, demanding to know the absolute truth about his real, current income. I asked him if there were any other massive, hidden current debts that my mother's investigators simply hadn't found yet. I was so upset and confused by his lies of omission that I even questioned his actual motives for wanting to marry me. I looked right at him and asked if he was just using our relationship and my family's wealth to secure his financial future and fix his old mistakes. Daniel did not yell back at me. He just stood there, staring at the private papers scattered across his kitchen counter. Then he slowly looked up at me. I will never forget the look on his face. There was pure pain in his eyes. He looked absolutely crushed that I had allowed my family to dig into his past like a criminal investigation. His voice was quiet and shaking when he finally spoke. He looked at me and asked, "You trust them more than you trust me?" That single question hung heavily in the quiet room. Our relationship fractured heavily in that exact moment. Instead of stopping to listen to his side of the story or trying to understand his perspective, I got incredibly defensive. I told him that if he hadn't hidden his bankruptcy, my family wouldn't have felt the need to investigate him in the first place. I found myself slowly taking my mother's side, genuinely believing that his financial secrets made him a dangerous liability to my future. I walked out of his apartment that night, leaving our relationship hanging by a thread. Things between Daniel and me were incredibly tense and distant for the next few days. We barely spoke to each other. That was when my dad, Charles, decided to officially step into the situation. My dad had always been the neutral, reasonable parent in our family. He never raised his voice, he avoided family drama, and he usually let my mother handle all the strict business decisions. Because of this, I always valued his opinion highly. He called me and asked me to meet him for a private lunch. We sat in a quiet corner booth at a nice restaurant, and he spoke to me very gently. He held my hand across the table and told me that he loved me and only wanted to protect my future. He looked genuinely concerned as he said that he simply didn't think Daniel was worthy of me. He calmly explained that marriage was a partnership, and Daniel's track record showed he couldn't be trusted. Because I trusted my dad's objective, calm perspective so much, my suspicion of Daniel deepened significantly. I convinced myself that if even my reasonable father thought Daniel was a bad choice, then the situation must be truly terrible. The final, fatal blow to our relationship happened the following week. Our family lawyer, Margaret, requested a formal meeting at her office to present the final prenuptial agreement. Daniel reluctantly agreed to attend the meeting with me. We sat on opposite sides of a large, cold conference table. Margaret slid the thick legal contract across the table to him. I already knew my parents wanted a strict agreement, but as Margaret read the terms out loud, I realized it was incredibly harsh and completely biased against Daniel. The document explicitly stated that he would get absolutely no share of any marital assets, no matter what happened. But it also did something else. It completely locked down all my personal financial rights, ensuring my family still controlled the money. Daniel spent a long time reading through the pages. When he finished, he closed the folder, pushed it back across the table, and flat out refused to sign it. He said he would not enter a marriage under those hostile conditions. Because I was already so heavily influenced by my parents, his refusal convinced me that he was just a gold digger who only wanted access to my wealth. I told him he was being unreasonable. He stood up from his chair, visibly hurt and completely exhausted by the constant battles. He walked out of the office, leaving me sitting there alone. We officially broke up right then, just 3 weeks before the wedding. With Daniel completely out of the picture, I honestly thought my life would finally quiet down. We had officially broken up just 3 weeks before our scheduled wedding date, and the reality of it left me entirely devastated. I spent the first few days after the breakup just sitting alone in my bedroom, staring blankly at the ceiling, feeling completely numb. I fully expected my family, especially my mother, to give me some space to grieve the end of my relationship. I naturally assumed that all the intense, high-pressure discussions about prenuptial agreements, asset protection, and trust funds would immediately stop. After all, there was no longer a marriage happening, so there was no theoretical husband to protect my money from. But that is exactly when the situation started to become incredibly strange. The financial discussions did not stop at all. In fact, they only got significantly worse and much more aggressive. My mother, Victoria, barely even acknowledged Daniel's absence or the fact that my heart was broken. Instead of comforting me or asking how I was doing, she relentlessly pushed me to finalize and sign the trust amendments. Every single day, whether we were having breakfast or passing each other in the hallway, she would bring up the paperwork. She constantly hounded me to officially transfer my financial assets into the new structure she and the estate lawyers had built. She was rushing the entire process frantically, acting as if we were running out of time. I simply could not understand her extreme urgency. One afternoon, she cornered me in the living room, handed me an expensive pen, and pushed the thick stack of papers toward me. She looked at me with an impatient, sharp expression and kept repeating a very specific sentence. "Once this is signed, after the wedding, you won't have to worry about a thing." That specific phrase stopped me dead in my tracks, and it completely haunted me for the rest of the day. I locked myself in my room, pacing back and forth, repeating her exact words over and over in my head. After the wedding. Why in the world was she still talking about a wedding? I had literally just broken off my engagement. There was no husband, no marital risk, and no impending legal threat to my family's wealth. So, why was the post-marriage protection plan still her absolute top priority? It made absolutely zero logical sense. Suddenly, a very dark, uncomfortable thought crept into my mind. For the first time in my entire life, I finally started to suspect my mother instead of Daniel. What if Daniel was never the actual problem? What if he was just in the way? I decided right then that I needed to investigate the situation in complete secret. I knew I couldn't trust my family's usual lawyers, so I took matters into my own hands. The very next morning, I made an excuse to leave the house and drove straight to my private bank. I sat down with my personal account manager and explicitly requested to see the original, unedited trust documents that my grandparents had originally set up for me. After securing those thick files, I found and consulted an entirely independent lawyer, someone who operated out of a small office downtown and had absolutely zero ties to the Whitmore family. I brought both the original documents and the new amendments my mother wanted me to sign, dropping them heavily onto his desk. I asked him to read everything and explain it to me in plain, everyday English. I sat in his quiet office for hours, watching him highlight different sections, and what he finally told me completely horrified me. He broke down the complicated legal jargon line by line. He explained that if I signed those new documents, I would entirely lose all legal control over my own assets. I wouldn't just be protecting my money from a spouse. I would be signing my entire financial freedom away. My parents would immediately gain total, unquestionable authority over every single dollar in my name. I wouldn't be able to buy a house, invest in a business, or even access my own inheritance without their explicit, written permission. The lawyer looked at me directly, adjusting his glasses, and stated that under this new structure, I would be completely reduced to receiving a strict monthly allowance from my parents for the rest of my adult life. I was in extreme shock. The terrifying truth finally hit me like a physical blow. Daniel was never the target. I realized I was the actual target all along. My own mother was actively trying to lock me out of my own money permanently. But the independent lawyer was not done revealing the truth. He looked deeply into the specific legal mechanisms my mother was using and uncovered even more information. He recognized the legal pattern, did some background checking on public estate records, and found a disturbing history. He told me that my mother, Victoria, had done the exact same thing to other people in my family. She had used this identical, aggressive strategy to take full control of my older brother's finances a few years ago. She had also successfully executed this exact same plan against my cousin and several other younger relatives. It wasn't a temporary protective measure at all. It was a highly calculated, proven pattern of strict financial control over the younger generation. I felt completely sick to my stomach, realizing my family was built on financial hostage-taking and manipulation. The guilt hit me immediately and overwhelmingly. I had blindly trusted the people actively trying to trap me, and in the process, I had completely destroyed my relationship with the man I genuinely loved. I immediately reached out to Daniel. I was terrified he wouldn't pick up, but he did. I asked him to meet me at a quiet, unassuming coffee shop on the edge of town, far from my family's usual high society spots. When I saw him walk through the door, looking so tired and defeated, I broke down. I apologized profusely for everything I had done. I told him how wrong I was to doubt him and explained the entire truth about what I had just discovered regarding my family and their secret plans to control my money. Daniel sat there quietly, listening to every single word without interrupting. He gently told me he still loved me, but I could clearly see in his eyes that he was deeply scarred by how I had treated him and how easily I had abandoned him. Then, Daniel took a deep breath, leaned across the table, and dropped a massive bombshell of his own. He looked me in the eyes and revealed the full, ugly extent of my mother's destructive actions. He told me that Victoria hadn't just looked up his public financial records. She had actively hired private investigators to dig deeply into his personal life behind his back. But it got much worse than just snooping. He revealed that she had secretly contacted his most important business partners. She used her massive high society influence and the weight of the Whitmore name to intentionally ruin his ongoing contracts, actively pushing investors to pull their funding just to make him look like a complete financial failure. At that exact moment, every single confusing piece of the puzzle finally clicked together in my head. My mother had deliberately and maliciously sabotaged my relationship to eliminate Daniel. She destroyed us simply because a smart, independent husband was a direct threat to her controlling my trust fund. Sitting in that quiet, unassuming coffee shop, staring at Daniel's exhausted face, I finally saw the complete, horrifying truth. I realized that my mother was intentionally eliminating Daniel from my life. He wasn't just an unsuitable partner in her strict eyes. He was a direct, dangerous threat to her grand, obsessive plan. She knew he was a smart, independent businessman, and she knew he would never allow her to casually take control of my trust fund. That was her real motive all along. She systematically destroyed my relationship, broke my heart, and secretly ruined Daniel's business contracts just to keep her tight grip on my money. A deep, burning anger quickly replaced all the sadness, confusion, and heartbreak I had felt over the past few weeks. I knew right then that I couldn't just walk away quietly and let her win. I needed to fight back. I needed a solid, foolproof plan for retaliation. I knew that confronting her directly in private would be completely useless. If I just yelled at her or accused her of manipulation, she would easily twist the narrative, call me hysterical, and use her massive legal team to crush me into submission. I had to beat her at her own game. I needed to set a public trap. The very next morning, I drove back to the massive Whitmore estate to execute the first phase of my plan. I sat in my car in the long driveway for 10 minutes, taking deep breaths and practicing my facial expressions in the rearview mirror. I had to look completely defeated, naive, and incredibly sorry. I walked into the house and found my mother sitting in her usual spot in the bright sunroom, drinking her morning tea and meticulously reviewing some complex financial reports. I approached her slowly, keeping my head down to avoid showing any real anger in my eyes. I took a deep breath, forced a slight tremble into my voice, and apologized to my mother directly. I forced real tears into my eyes and told her that she was absolutely right about everything. I said I had been blinded by stupid, naive love, but the breakup had finally made me see Daniel's true, greedy colors. I told her I was fully ready to follow her guidance to protect the family's legacy. Without showing any hesitation, I agreed to sign the harsh, prenuptial agreement. I also looked her straight in the eye and explicitly agreed to amend the trust documents, just like she wanted. Victoria completely bought my performance. She genuinely believed she had won. I watched her face transform from its usual strict irritation to a smug, highly satisfied smile. She stood up, walked over to me, and wrapped her arms around me. It was the coldest, most calculated gesture of affection I had ever experienced in my life, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to physically push her away. She praised me for finally maturing and seeing reason like a proper Whitmore. I told her that I had spoken to Daniel and demanded he accept our strict financial terms if he still wanted the wedding to happen. Because my mother was so incredibly arrogant and convinced of her own power, she didn't even question this lie. She fully believed that her relentless manipulation had successfully broken him into submission. Within just a few hours, she had her personal assistants and the luxury wedding planners back on the phone, putting the entire massive event back on track. She was absolutely thrilled because she thought she was getting exactly what she wanted: the perfect, flawless high society wedding for public appearances and total, legal control over my finances behind closed doors. But while she was busy calling expensive caterers and florists, I was busy setting the real, fatal trap. I knew that simply exposing the unfair legal documents wouldn't be enough to completely destroy her control. My parents had too many expensive, highly trained lawyers who could easily explain away the paperwork as a standard family protection measure. I needed undeniable, concrete proof of her actual, malicious intent. I needed everyone in our circle to hear exactly how she viewed me, Daniel, and the money. I needed to capture her own harsh words. So, I went to an electronics store, bought a high-quality digital voice recorder, and spent 2 days figuring out exactly how to bait her into a full confession. I decided to use her own massive ego against her. I knew she loved feeling superior and enjoyed explaining her brilliant, ruthless strategies. 3 days before we were scheduled to leave for the final wedding preparations, I walked into her private home office late at night. I had the recorder turned on and safely hidden deep inside the pocket of my thick cardigan. I knocked softly on the heavy wooden door and walked in, intentionally pretending to look anxious and unsure. I sat in the large leather chair across from her mahogany desk and told her I was still feeling a little nervous about the new trust structure. I asked her to explain the details to me one more time, just to make me feel completely secure before I signed my name. She sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by my apparent weakness, but she leaned back in her expensive chair and started talking. I carefully and strategically guided the conversation. I asked her why the documents gave her and my dad so much absolute power over my daily, personal expenses. That simple question was all it took. Her ego took over completely. She clearly admitted to wanting to control my assets. She didn't use polite, confusing legal terms anymore. She was painfully blunt. She stated flat out that I lacked the mental and financial capacity to handle my own money. Hearing my own mother call me incompetent and stupid to my face took a massive toll on me, but I kept my mouth shut, gripped the fabric of my chair, and let her keep talking. Then I casually brought up Daniel. I asked why she had pushed so hard to aggressively investigate him if the trust was going to be locked down safely anyway. She sneered, her face twisting with disgust, and called Daniel completely worthless. She actually bragged about how incredibly easy it was to use our family name to scare off his investors and ruin his business. Finally, I asked her the most important question. I asked her why she couldn't just trust me, her own daughter, with my rightful inheritance. She looked at me with absolute, chilling coldness and declared that the money must stay with her. She said I was just a naive girl who would ruin the family fortune and that the Whitmore wealth belonged strictly under her management, regardless of what the original legal trust stated. I had it. I had the entire, ugly truth recorded in crystal clear, undeniable audio. I thanked her for her time, walked calmly out of her office, went straight up to my bedroom, and locked the door. I immediately connected the recorder to my laptop and backed up the audio file to 3 different secure cloud servers. I put on my headphones and listened to the recording one more time. Hearing her voice actively admit to everything, the business sabotage, the financial control, the utter lack of respect for my basic independence, solidified my resolve. There was absolutely no going back now. My retaliation plan was fully in motion, and it was perfect. The next morning, the massive house was incredibly chaotic with the final, frantic preparations for the upcoming trip. We were all packing to leave for the rehearsal dinner at a luxury resort in Napa. I watched my mother meticulously pack her expensive designer dresses and loudly coordinate travel details with her stressed assistant. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I held the ultimate power to destroy her entire carefully constructed world. I packed my own bags with a strange, dark sense of calm. I wasn't just packing clothes for a fancy wedding weekend. I was packing for my final escape. I knew exactly what was going to happen when we arrived in Napa Valley. I was going to let her gather all her important high society friends, our entire extended family, and her expensive legal team in one room. I was going to let her firmly believe she was about to force me to sign away my freedom. And then I was going to burn her entire empire to the ground. The drive to the luxury resort in Napa was incredibly quiet on my end, but my mother never stopped talking. She sat in the passenger seat of the luxury SUV, dictating final schedule changes to her assistant over the phone. We pulled into the massive, sweeping driveway of the resort just after lunch. The place was famous for hosting exclusive, high-society events, and Victoria had rented out the entire private vineyard estate for our family and the most important guests. The moment we stepped out of the car, she was instantly in control, directing the hotel staff on where to put our luggage and aggressively checking the floral arrangements in the grand lobby. I just stood there quietly, watching her operate. She genuinely believed everything was going exactly according to her master plan. She thought I was completely broken and ready to hand over my entire life to her. I played my part perfectly. I kept my head down, nodded when she spoke to me, and gave fake smiles to the hotel managers. Later that afternoon, I went up to my private suite to get dressed for the rehearsal dinner. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and just stood in the middle of the room for a long time. I looked at the expensive designer dress my mother had picked out for me to wear. It was beautiful, but it felt like a uniform. It felt like I was dressing up as the perfect, obedient Whitmore daughter one last time. I sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled my phone out of my purse. I opened my files and checked the audio recording I had secretly captured the night before. I pressed play and listened to the first few seconds of her cold, calculating voice just to remind myself why I was doing this. I didn't feel nervous anymore. I only felt a deep, heavy sense of finality. I put my phone back in my purse, put on the dress, and walked downstairs to face my family. The rehearsal dinner was held in a stunning private dining room overlooking the rolling hills of the vineyard. Long tables were set with crisp white linens, expensive crystal glasses, and elaborate floral centerpieces. All of our extended family members, the top-tier high society guests, and several partners from my parents' law firm were already there, drinking expensive wine and laughing loudly. When I walked into the room, people immediately came up to me. They asked me where Daniel was, assuming he was just running late. I lied smoothly, telling them he was taking care of a last-minute business issue, but would be joining us soon. My dad, Charles, walked over and gave me a tight hug. He looked relieved, probably because he thought the family drama was finally over. He had no idea what was actually about to happen. We all sat down for dinner. Victoria had deliberately placed herself at the absolute head of the main table. She positioned me directly to her right. To my immediate left sat Margaret, our lead family lawyer. The seating arrangement wasn't an accident. It was a physical trap. They were boxing me in. The dinner service lasted for 2 excruciating hours. Course after course of expensive food was brought out, but I couldn't eat a single bite. I just drank water and watched the people around me. I listened to my aunts and uncles talk about stock portfolios and vacation homes. I watched my mother hold court, smiling her fake, polite smile at the guests while occasionally throwing a sharp, warning glance in my direction to make sure I was behaving. The tension in my chest was building with every minute that passed. Finally, the waiters cleared the dessert plates, and the room started to quiet down. This was the exact moment. I saw Victoria give a very subtle, sharp nod to Margaret. Margaret immediately reached down into her heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. She placed it directly on the table in front of me. It was the amended trust documents, the exact paperwork designed to strip me of all my financial rights. Victoria didn't even try to hide what she was doing. She wanted me to sign it right there, in front of all the most important people in our lives, as a public display of my complete submission. She slid an expensive silver pen across the tablecloth toward me. The entire table went completely silent. Every single guest stopped talking and turned to look at us. My mother leaned in close to me. She kept her voice low, but incredibly firm. "Sign it now, Elena," she whispered. "Let's put all this messy business behind us, so we can focus on the wedding." I looked at the thick stack of papers. I looked at the silver pen. Then, I slowly looked up and made direct eye contact with my mother. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I stood up from my chair. The sudden movement made the heavy wooden chair scrape loudly against the hardwood floor, echoing in the quiet room. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I turned the volume all the way up. "Before I sign this, I want everyone to hear something," I announced, my voice ringing out clearly across the large dining room. I didn't wait for anyone to object. I pressed play on the audio file and set the phone down right in the middle of the table. In the dead silence of the room, my mother's recorded voice played loud and clear. The audio clearly captured her explicitly admitting to controlling my assets. Everyone heard her call Daniel completely worthless and a financial failure. They heard her state, without any hesitation, that I lacked the mental capacity to handle my own money. And finally, the entire room heard her declare that the money must strictly stay with her, regardless of the law. The reaction was instant and explosive. The high society guests were absolutely shocked. Several people physically gasped and covered their mouths. The quiet murmurs turned into loud, confused whispers. I looked down at my dad. Charles looked completely stunned. He had dropped his napkin on the floor and was staring at Victoria with wide, horrified eyes. He clearly hadn't known the full, malicious extent of her plan. But the most terrifying reaction was my mother's. Victoria didn't gasp. She didn't try to stop the recording. She just sat there, her face completely cold and devoid of any human emotion. Her mask had completely fallen off, exposing the ruthless dictator underneath. The recording finally ended, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room again. The confrontation reached its absolute peak. I looked straight down at my mother, no longer pretending to be the weak, naive daughter she thought I was. "I am not your property," I said to her, my voice steady and completely fearless. Victoria finally stood up, matching my stance. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny the recording. She just glared at me with pure, unadulterated anger. "Everything you have is because of me," she shot back loudly, not caring who heard her. "You are nothing without this family's money." I didn't back down an inch. I looked around the room at all the wealthy, silent guests, then looked right back at her. "I would rather lose the money than lose myself," I told her clearly. Right there, in front of our entire family, the lawyers, and her high society friends, I explicitly refused to sign the documents. I declared, loudly and officially, that I was withdrawing from the trust entirely. I told them they could keep every single cent. I picked up my purse, turned my back on my mother, and started walking toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. I didn't look back at Charles. I didn't look at Margaret. I chose my own freedom in that exact moment. I walked straight out of the luxury resort, leaving my family and their toxic wealth behind me in that silent room. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of that private dining room, and I did not look back. The cool night air of Napa Valley hit my face as I stepped out of the luxury resort, leaving my entire family and their toxic wealth behind me in that silent room. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking violently from the adrenaline of the confrontation. For a brief second, I stopped in the middle of the massive gravel driveway, half expecting someone to run out after me. I thought maybe my dad would push through the heavy doors, tell me to wait, or try to calm the explosive situation down. But the doors remained firmly shut. Nobody followed me out into the dark. I pulled out my phone, ordered a standard rideshare car, and stood alone under the streetlights. When the plain, dented sedan pulled up next to my family's expensive sports cars, I got in, gave the driver the address to a cheap motel near the airport, and watched the Whitmore Estate vineyard disappear in the rearview mirror. I had just lost my massive inheritance, but as I sat in the back of that quiet, normal car, I finally felt completely free. The real, practical consequences of my decision hit me the very next morning with brutal speed. I woke up in the cheap motel room and walked down to the lobby to buy a simple cup of coffee and a stale pastry. I swiped my primary black credit card, the exact card I had used my entire adult life, without a single second thought. The machine beeped aggressively, and the screen flashed a bright red, declined message. I pulled out my secondary card, the one linked to a completely different bank account. It was declined again. I tried my standard debit card, hoping to just use whatever cash was left in my daily checking account. Declined. Victoria had moved faster than I could have ever imagined. She made good on her angry threats immediately and completely cut off all my finances overnight. I walked back to my room, sat on the edge of the uncomfortable bed, and logged into my mobile banking app. Every single account with the Whitmore name attached to it was entirely frozen or completely drained of available funds. By noon, I received a cold, formal legal email from Margaret, our lead family lawyer. The email didn't ask how I was doing. It officially confirmed that I was legally removed from the family trust and that I had permanently lost my inheritance. I was completely cut off from the only financial ecosystem I had ever known. I couldn't rent a car, I couldn't book a nice flight home, and I couldn't even pay for another night at the motel using my usual methods. But losing the money wasn't the absolute hardest part of that first week. The absolute hardest part was my dad's reaction. Or rather, his complete lack of one. My dad, Charles, stayed completely silent. For the first few days, I kept my phone right next to me at all times, staring at the blank screen. Every time it vibrated with a spam email or a news alert, I jumped, desperately hoping it was him calling me. I kept playing our previous conversations over and over in my head. I vividly remembered when he sat me down in that quiet restaurant booth just a few weeks ago, holding my hand and speaking gently to me. He had pretended to act like the neutral, reasonable parent who only wanted to protect me from a bad marriage. Because he had always played the role of the quiet peacemaker in our loud family, I genuinely believed he would eventually reach out to me. I thought he would secretly call me from his private office to apologize. I hoped he would tell me he didn't know the full, malicious extent of Victoria's legal plan to trap me, or at least call just to check if I had enough money to eat dinner. He never called. He never sent a single text message. He never emailed. As the days turned into weeks, his deep, unbroken silence became a heavy physical weight on my chest. His silence was actually much louder and much more painful than my mother's screaming. Victoria's anger was loud, predictable, and obvious. She was a dictator losing control of her favorite, most valuable asset. But Charles's silence was a profound, quiet betrayal. It proved to me that he was completely complicit in the entire scheme all along. He had sat there and watched my mother systematically destroy my relationship with Daniel. He had watched her try to steal my financial freedom, and he had simply let it happen. He actively chose his comfortable, wealthy lifestyle and his quiet peace with Victoria over the well-being of his own daughter. Realizing that the father I always trusted was just a coward who valued family money over me was incredibly painful. I had to force myself to stop waiting for his call and face my completely new, harsh reality. I had no access to the family funds, no trust account, and absolutely no safety net to fall back on. I had to figure out how to survive immediately. I opened my suitcase on the motel floor and laid out the few items I had packed for the rehearsal dinner weekend. I had a few expensive designer dresses, a couple of high-end handbags, and some personal jewelry that I had bought myself over the years before the trust issue started. I took all of it to a high-end consignment shop in the city. I sold the few small assets I still independently owned just to get enough actual cash to rent a cheap apartment and buy basic groceries. Standing at the glass counter, watching the store owner casually calculate the resale value of my old life was a deeply humbling experience. I walked out of that store with a thin envelope of cash in my pocket, feeling completely broke but lighter than I had in years. The transition from being a wealthy, protected Whitmore heiress to a completely normal person was incredibly difficult. I had to learn how to budget every single dollar I spent, how to shop for groceries using discount coupons, and how to navigate public city transportation because I had left my expensive car at the resort in Napa. I took a regular entry-level job at a small, local marketing firm. The weekly pay was just a tiny fraction of what my monthly trust allowance used to be, but the money I earned finally belonged to me and nobody else. There were nights when I sat alone in my small, drafty apartment, eating cheap takeout food and staring at the empty walls, feeling entirely overwhelmed by the sudden, massive change in my life. I cried many times during those first few months. The grief of losing my entire family was a very heavy burden to carry. I grieved the parents I thought I had, and I grieved the easy, comfortable future I had aggressively walked away from. But underneath all that pain, fear, and grief, there was a steady, growing foundation of pure relief. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. I didn't have to decode every single conversation to find my mother's hidden manipulation. I didn't have to attend exhausting Sunday dinners and listen to her sharply interrogate my choices or the people I loved. I was no longer a pawn in Victoria's aggressive financial chess game. I had stated clearly at the dinner table that I was not her property, and I was finally living that truth every single day. The deafening silence from my family simply meant they couldn't hurt me or control me anymore. I was finally building a life that was entirely my own, brick by brick. And as the chaotic dust of my old life finally began to settle, I knew it was time to address the biggest, most important unresolved piece of my past. It was time to reach out and see if there was anything left to salvage with Daniel. It had been exactly 6 months since I walked out of that luxury resort in Napa, officially losing my inheritance and leaving my family behind. My mother had immediately cut off all my finances just as she threatened, and my dad had maintained his painful, cowardly silence. During those 6 months, I focused entirely on surviving. I worked overtime at my entry-level marketing job, learned how to budget my small paycheck, and slowly adjusted to living in my drafty, cramped apartment. I needed to prove to myself that I could actually live a fully independent life before I even thought about bringing anyone else into it. I didn't want to reach out to Daniel just because I was lonely or struggling. I wanted to reach out to him as a completely self-sufficient adult woman who had finally broken free from her family's toxic control. When I finally felt stable and grounded in my new reality, I picked up my phone and called him. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was firm. He answered after a few rings, his voice sounding cautious and guarded. I didn't push him or make any grand, emotional demands. I simply asked if he would be willing to meet me for a short cup of coffee at a completely normal, average diner downtown. He hesitated for a moment, which I entirely deserved, but eventually he agreed. We met on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. When I walked into the diner, I saw him sitting in a corner booth. He looked tired, but his eyes were still the same. I slid into the booth across from him, wearing simple, cheap clothes instead of the expensive designer brands my mother used to force on me. I started talking immediately because I wanted to put all my cards on the table. I told him everything that happened after our harsh breakup. I explained how I discovered my mother's true, malicious intentions to control my trust fund, and how I found out about her calculated pattern of financial abuse against other family members. I told him about the secret audio recording I made and how I played it out loud in front of all the high society guests and lawyers at the rehearsal dinner. I watched his eyes widen in shock as I described the look on my mother's face and how I explicitly refused to sign the documents, choosing my freedom over the family wealth. I laid it all out clearly, without making any excuses for my past behavior. I apologized directly to him again, acknowledging how deeply I had hurt him by trusting their lies over his honesty. Daniel sat there quietly, digesting the massive amount of information. He looked at me for a long time, really studying my face and my new demeanor. He told me that the aftermath of our breakup had been incredibly hard for him. The damage my mother had intentionally done to his business contacts had taken months to repair, and the emotional betrayal he felt from me had left a deep scar. But then his voice softened. He told me he was genuinely proud of me for standing up to them and walking away from the money. He admitted that he still loved me, but he made it explicitly clear that we could not just go back to the way things were. He needed to know that my family's shadow was permanently gone. I agreed with him completely. We decided right then and there to start rebuilding our relationship, but we agreed to do it very slowly, keeping things completely realistic and incredibly mature. Our reconciliation was not a sudden fairy tale romance. It was a deliberate, day-by-day choice to slowly rebuild broken trust. We didn't go on expensive vacations or eat at exclusive 5-star restaurants. Instead, we spent our time doing the most ordinary, mundane things together. We went grocery shopping on Sunday mornings, comparing prices and using discount coupons. We cooked simple dinners in my small kitchen, taking turns washing the dishes. We sat on my cheap, uncomfortable couch and talked for hours about our actual, realistic financial goals and our plans for the future. He shared the details of how his business was slowly recovering without my mother's interference, and I shared the small victories I experienced at my new job. We were building a true, equal partnership based on mutual respect and complete honesty, not a relationship dictated by family wealth and aggressive legal protection. When we spent time together, we often talked about the stark differences between our current reality and the life we almost had. I vividly remembered the harsh, prenuptial agreement my family's lawyer had tried to force on him, the document designed to leave him with absolutely nothing while locking me away in a gilded cage. In our new life, we didn't have any secret legal documents or hostile trust structures dividing us. We shared the costs of our dates and talked openly about our individual budgets. The complete transparency between us was incredibly healing. Whenever a practical issue arose, we didn't panic or point fingers. We sat down, looked at the facts, and solved the problem together as equal partners. This level of practical, daily independence completely changed my perspective on love and security. I realized that back when I was engaged the first time, I was constantly looking for my mother's approval to validate my choices. I had allowed her suspicion to poison my own mind because I didn't trust my own judgment. The long, slow process of our reconciliation forced me to trust myself first. Before Daniel could fully trust me again, I had to prove to myself that I was capable of making my own decisions and standing by them, regardless of the consequences. Living completely independently, dealing with real-world problems at work, and paying my own rent on time gave me the concrete confidence I desperately needed. I wasn't just bringing my heart into the relationship. I was bringing a strong, tested, and entirely self-reliant version of myself. Daniel noticed the change in me, and it fundamentally altered the dynamic of our relationship for the better. He no longer felt like he was competing against a massive, faceless family empire for my loyalty. He knew that if I was standing next to him, it was because I actively, consciously chose to be there every single day. The power imbalance that had heavily plagued our initial engagement was completely erased. We were slowly, steadily building a deeply connected, mature partnership that was firmly rooted in reality, far away from the toxic influence of the Whitmore wealth. As another year passed, our bond grew stronger and much more resilient than it ever was before. We had faced the absolute worst of my family's toxic manipulation, and we had survived it together. I was no longer the naive heiress blindly following orders, and he was no longer the scrutinized target of a hostile investigation. We were just two independent adults choosing to share our lives. That was when we decided to take the next practical step together. I gathered the very last remaining pieces of my old life, a few pieces of personal jewelry I had bought myself and 2 old designer handbags, and sold them to a private buyer. It wasn't a massive fortune, but it was completely clean money that belonged strictly to me. I combined the cash from selling my remaining small assets with the money I had rigorously saved from my marketing job. Daniel matched my contribution with the profits he had steadily rebuilt from his business. Together, we used that combined money to buy a very small, modest house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. It was a simple structure with a small front porch and a tiny backyard, completely different from the massive, sprawling Whitmore estate. The house needed a lot of work, the paint was peeling, and the plumbing was old, but we didn't care. We spent every single weekend in old clothes, painting the walls ourselves, fixing the broken cabinets, and planting a small garden. Standing in the middle of our small living room, covered in cheap paint, I finally felt completely safe and truly at home. I officially sold the very last small portion of my personal assets to fully fund our new life. The process of selling my old designer items, expensive shoes, and jewelry gave me the exact cash I needed to buy our small house. It was not a grand estate like the ones my family owned, but it was entirely ours. Moving into that house marked the true, physical beginning of me living completely independently. The transition away from my old life of extreme wealth and power was incredibly drastic, but I was absolutely determined to cut the cord of dependence permanently. Every single day in that small house, I learned what adult female autonomy actually looked like in the real world. I was no longer the naive heiress controlled by family money. I was a regular woman paying her own bills, calculating her own grocery budget, and making her own daily choices without anyone's permission. Daniel and I continued to heal our relationship very slowly. We did not rush into anything, choosing instead to be incredibly practical and mature about our future together. Our daily routine involved working hard at our regular jobs, cooking simple meals in our small kitchen, and openly discussing our finances without any hidden legal documents or secret agendas. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my family's extreme family control was entirely gone from our daily lives. We no longer had to worry about my mother, Victoria, hiring private investigators or intentionally ruining Daniel's business contracts behind his back. The stark contrast between my past and my present was obvious every single day. We were living a quiet life built on actual trust and honest partnership, proving definitively that our bond was a genuine case of true love versus money. As the months turned into a full year, we finally felt completely secure and entirely stable in our rebuilt relationship. We had faced the worst of the manipulation and survived it. That was when we decided to officially get married, but we agreed immediately that it had to be a very simple wedding. There would be no luxury resort in Napa Valley, no expensive event planners, and absolutely no high society guests staring at us. We completely rejected the toxic, public spectacle that my mother had originally planned for us. Instead, we chose a small, quiet, ordinary courthouse downtown for the ceremony. I did not wear the expensive designer dress Victoria had picked out for the original rehearsal dinner. I bought a simple, plain white dress from a standard retail store using my own paycheck, and Daniel wore a normal, dark suit he already owned. We did not invite any extended family members or corporate lawyers to witness the event. It was just the two of us and a couple of close, genuine friends standing in that small room. Standing in front of the judge in that plain courthouse, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm and absolute clarity. Nobody handed Daniel a thick manila folder containing a harsh prenuptial agreement designed to lock away my financial rights and leave him with nothing. There were no secret trust fund amendments waiting to be signed immediately after the ceremony to strip me of my power. I was not marrying Daniel under the heavy, judgmental watch of my mother, and I was not waiting for my father, Charles, to finally speak up and defend me. My mother had completely cut off my finances long ago, and my dad had maintained his painful, cowardly silence, leaving me entirely stripped of my massive inheritance. Losing that money and being cut off from my family was incredibly painful at first, but standing there holding Daniel's hand, I knew the massive financial loss had directly bought my absolute freedom. The simple wedding ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, but it was the most honest, authentic moment of my entire life. After we walked out of the courthouse as husband and wife, we didn't host a massive, catered reception with expensive champagne. We simply drove back to our small house, ordered a large delivery pizza, and opened a cheap bottle of wine on our front porch. We sat side by side on the old wooden steps, looking out at our small, unkempt yard. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with regular working-class families just like us. As I sat there eating pizza in my cheap wedding dress, I let myself think about my family one final time. I thought about the massive Whitmore estate, the warm yellow light strung across the vineyard, and the fake, polite smiles of the wealthy guests from our original engagement party. I realized then that my parents, especially Victoria, were completely trapped in their own gilded cage of wealth and power. Their desperate, obsessive need for family control had permanently destroyed their relationship with their own daughter. They had chosen the money over me, but I had actively chosen myself. The long, exhausting battle was officially over. I had faced the ultimate test of family control and successfully broken out of their carefully designed financial trap before it could snap shut. I had lost the immense wealth I was born into, but I had gained something significantly more valuable and permanent. I had gained my complete autonomy, a healthy, mature relationship with a man who truly respected me, and a life that belonged strictly to me. I didn't have to look over my shoulder, decode secret emails, or second-guess anyone's motives ever again. The deafening silence from my family was no longer a source of deep pain. It was the definitive, constant sound of my hard-won independence. This new life was the ultimate symbolic ending to my past. As the sun started to set over our quiet street, Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand firmly. I looked at him, smiled, and took a deep breath of the cool evening air. This was my exact reality now, and I was entirely responsible for every single part of it. Sitting right here on this front porch, far away from the toxic influence of the Whitmore name, I finally understood the fundamental difference between my family and me. My family always believed that money meant safety. They built their entire existence around protecting their assets, aggressively controlling their children, and hoarding their wealth out of extreme fear. But as I sit here today, completely cut off from their vast empire, but happier and more secure than I have ever been, I know the absolute truth. I learned the hard way that true safety is simply having the right to live your own life.